Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Joe Brockmeier is back. We're going to talk about Fedora 21, 21st release of Fedora. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Joe Brockmeier. Episode 319, recorded December 17th, 2014. Fedora 21. This episode is brought to you by Mandrill. Mandrill is a scalable, reliable, and secure email infrastructure service trusted by more than 300,000 customers. Sign up at mandrill.com, promo code TWIT, and you'll receive 50,000 free email sends per month for your first 6 months of service. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, or as often as I can, movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, projects you may never heard of, projects you may be using every day and totally unaware of it. I've been gone for a couple of weeks, out on a big cruise ship. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the show, but let's go ahead and bring on my co-host, Joe Zonker Brockmeier. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. I'm glad to finally have some time to be on the show. The last couple of months have been pretty fantastic at work with meetings and all that fun. So glad to have Wednesday morning free once again.
And up until a couple days ago, we didn't even have a show scheduled for today. And I want to congratulate you for your fast action work to be able to pull a show together for today, which is also while you're on the show, also that you could be a co-host as well. Why don't you go ahead and introduce the subject of this show so that we can get started with the show? Okay.
So today I had the great pleasure to welcome on Mathew Miller, who is the Fedora Project leader. And we just had a Fedora release go out the door last week on Tuesday, Fedora 21, which has been almost a year, if not longer, in the making. So we're going to be talking about Fedora 21, the Fedora.next initiative, and pretty much all things Fedora this hour.
Yeah, and we actually had Fedora on, but when I went back through my notes, it was May of 2009, episode 71. So if you're listening at home, you can pause this show and go off and find episode 71 and go listen to that. And then this will be more information. We'll probably repeat most of it because that's 5 or 6 years ago, but a lot's happened in the Fedora community since then.
I think things may have changed just a little bit. I think we've had 2 or 3 different FPLs in that time frame, and obviously quite a few releases. So, yeah, things have changed just a little bit there.
Very good, very good. Well, it's good to have Mathew on the show, but we'll bring him on in just a moment. And what I want to also tell you is that this episode is brought to you by Mandrill, a scalable, reliable, and secure email infrastructure service trusted by more than 300,000 customers. It's easy to set up and integrate with existing apps, and it's fast, too. Integrate, deliver, track, and analyze. Detailed delivery reports, advanced analytics, and a friendly interface mean your entire team, from developers to marketers, can easily monitor and evaluate email performance. With servers all over the world, Mandrill can deliver your email in milliseconds. Mandrill started as an idea in 2010. Growing fast and innovating faster, Mandrill is now the largest email as a service platform on the market. Use Mandrill to send automated one-to-one email like password resets and welcome messages, as well as marketing emails and customized newsletters. We made it for developers who love documentation, integrations, high delivery rates, webhooks, and analytics. Mandrill comes with a beautiful interface, flexible template options, custom tagging, and advanced tracking and reports. Mandrill is the only email infrastructure service with a mobile app that lets you monitor delivery and troubleshoot from wherever you are. It's powerful, scalable, and affordable, but you don't have to take our word for it. Right now, Mandrill is offering the Twit audience a special deal. Sign up at mandrill.com, promo code TWIT, and you'll receive 50,000 free email sends per month for your first 6 months of service. That's mandrill.com, mandrill.com, promo code TWIT. We do thank Mandrill for support of the Twit Network, especially this show. And now let's go ahead and bring on our guest. Mathew, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Great, great. And where are you speaking to us from?
I am speaking to you from my home in Somerville, Massachusetts. This is my living room rather than my home office. It seemed like a nicer place to do a podcast from.
Oh, very cool, very cool. I'm in. I didn't mention at the top of the show, but I'm back in Beaverton, so this is my Beaverton apartment, my badly lit Beaverton apartment bedroom. So, very good, very good. So, Joe mentioned a little bit about what Fedora is, but let's go ahead and start back. Like, people don't know anything about Fedora. What would you say to them?
Fedora is one of the leading open source Linux distributions. We've been around for 10 years, and it is the upstream for Red Hat Enterprise Linux and for other rebuild distributions that follow from that, like CentOS and Scientific Linux.
And so what do you mean when you say upstream?
So this is kind of a common concept in open source where we have, you think of, open source as a river, I guess. And I know there's some sort of horrible pollution metaphor here, which is not intended. But basically, the software gets integrated into Fedora early on and then flows down from the work we do in Fedora to those other distributions. And Fedora as a distribution is kind of a middle point because all of the software that we package up into Fedora is its own upstream. So that's sort of the metaphor. It kind of, I guess it's a waterfall sort of thing where it comes down in stages.
So how did the Fedora project get started?
Wow, this is 10 years ago, quite a bit of a long time. It initially started as a set of add-on packages for Red Hat Linux back when it was Red Hat Linux, where the original distribution was a thing that Red Hat was putting together and releasing as an open source project, but they would develop it internally and then there'd be releases. And so a community started developing, adding packages onto that. And then when Red Hat switched to their enterprise Linux model and decided to really go after the enterprise market and stop producing Red Hat Linux, there was still a need for that community upstream. And so Red Hat merged what had been the Red Hat Linux with this community project to form Fedora as we know it. Well, not quite as we know it now. The initial instance of Fedora, and then it's gone through some changes since then.
Okay, and so I also noticed that, well, what's the big announcement that you have from like the last couple of weeks?
Well, yeah, we recently just had our 21st release here. So we've been doing a release just about every 6 months for the past decade. And actually, having done that, this was, I've got a cat going to knock everything down here. Hold on. Cat problems. All right. That was going to be a disaster. Awesome.
Useless use of cat, yes.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's going to be a little bit more than minimally released wasted resources, though. It's going to be a broken computer or something. Yeah, Fedora 21 release. So we've been putting out releases on basically a 6-month cadence. And for this most recent release, we decided actually to spend some time working on infrastructure and QA and made a longer cycle. So we had actually a full 1-year cycle, which was a little bit longer than intended even. But so finally, after all that, we have our 21st release out. And so we've been running around getting that out the door. It's been very exciting.
So one of the interesting things about Fedora.next and the Fedora 21 release, you want to talk a little bit about the different flavors of Fedora 21 and what people maybe who haven't used Fedora in a few years might find different if they came back to Fedora and tried it out now.
Yeah, so I'll go back to that history conversation a little bit. So initially, when Fedora started, sort of the inherited audience from the Red Hat Linux back then was pretty diverse, but included a fairly big enthusiast base and a big sysadmin base, people who are running, getting Linux into their organizations and using Red Hat Linux kind of became part of the Fedora base. And then over the years, as people worked on Fedora, we often have had the soul-searching question about who are we making this for? What's the target audience? And it had kind of become more and more focused onto sort of the desktop part of Fedora as a Linux desktop distribution. And that's awesome. I'm not trying to downplay that at all, because Fedora is a great Linux desktop distribution. But as part of the work on making a target and saying this is who we're going to develop it for, some of the sysadmin audience kind of felt like they didn't have a good voice in the project, and particularly Red Hat as a downstream distribution, Red Hat Enterprise Linux as obviously a very large server base. There's sometimes some disconnect between what the people using Fedora on a desktop and people who wanted to use Fedora for server and use downstream distributions wanted. So we had, for example, an argument about whether LVM, the partitioning, which is a advanced partitioning scheme, should be used. It's very common in enterprises. It lets you do a lot of more complicated storage setups, but it seemed like overkill on the desktop, so people wanted to turn it off in Fedora. And then a lot of system administrators were like, wait, no, that's important. And so it was a big fight kind of about goals. And then that's sort of an example of some other ways where the distribution was kind of pulling in different directions. So as part of looking what we want to do for the next 10 years, we looked at some of the different directions that the distribution is pulling and actually decided that we're going to make those into different distinct targets, where we have Fedora Workstation, which is kind of focused to be for software developers and people who want to have a capable desktop that is desktop focused, doesn't necessarily get in the way of distractions, and can be really good for developing, not just developing Fedora, but developing whatever software on it. Like if you basically the line we use is you go to a conference and you see a bunch of people who are, it's a Linux conference, but a bunch of people are talking on their Macs or typing on their Macs in the conference, and we want to get those people back running Linux, and so that's our foray into doing that. Then we have a separate Fedora server, which is, again, a place to be a voice for that server audience, and are also exploring some new technology there. We have some things, Cockpit, which is a new modern web user interface for easy systems management, and some behind-the-scenes parts as well to make easy deployment of different servers, different server roles simple. And then we have a Fedora Cloud, which is a more experimental area where we're trying to go into new areas, which is where the future of operating systems seems to be going.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Obviously, I have a bit of an interest in that area particularly, but maybe let's talk about what's happened in the last couple of years, because cloud wasn't even a consideration around, say, the Fedora 18 timeframe, if I'm not mistaken. I know that there hasn't been a cloud like an AMI or an offering for running in public or private cloud for a while. It only became official, using air quotes, as official in Fedora 20, if I'm remembering correctly. So let's talk a little bit about that. 19. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Right. So first of all, I want to cloud's kind of it is a buzzword. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So there are sort of three general categories of stuff people mean when they're talking about cloud. And one of those is like remote storage. Oh, it's out in the cloud somewhere. And that's not what we're talking about here. The second one is cloud infrastructure, things like OpenStack and basically systems you would set up to run a cloud locally. And that's important to Fedora, but that's also not what we're talking about here. So the third thing is this idea of cloud computing as a commodity, utility computing, and running your computing remotely. It's sort of a next step from having a virtualization setup somewhere where IT sets up your VMs for you, and then you get remote machines that way, where you are able to sort of deploy your own machine. So the Fedora Cloud effort has focused on making Fedora images that run in those cloud environments. That's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about Fedora Cloud. And people have been working on that for, I think, since Fedora 15 or so, gradually. And we have what we call the cloud base image, which is basically a very minimal Fedora version with cloud in it, which is a standard provisioning tool, so that when you set up each cloud instance, it can get the information it needs to do what that specific instance is trying to do. And so we've been working on that, and that's getting better and better. Particularly, we've been working on getting the package set minimized, because as disk space grew over the last 20 years, Linux distributions stopped worrying so much about making the package set small because disk space was cheap and it was easier to just put lots of stuff in there rather than to worrying about breaking it down. And now suddenly in this cloud computing world, network traffic and disk space and scalability issues come into play, and it suddenly matters again to make things small. So we've been going back and working on that, and so we've gotten the that image down so it's something like 350 megabytes on disk and a compressed image of 100 megabytes for basically the whole minimal operating system, which starting from a base like Fedora is a pretty big accomplishment. If you're starting from like a tiny boot Linux, you could obviously be smaller, but for a full featured OS that you can then easily add everything back as the specific things you need can be added back easily, it makes a really good base to build any kind of scale out application on top of. Additionally, we have the thing that actually Joe is working on, which is Project Atomic, which is a more radical re-envisioning of how we put the operating system together. I don't know, Joe, do you want to kick it back to you to describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, well, you wanted to talk, you mentioned buzzwords, and no conversation about Fedora would be complete. We couldn't help people complete their buzzword bingo cards at home unless we brought up Docker during this conversation, right?
Docker, as we say.
Docker. We need to just get like a little clip of Dan Walsh that we can just splice into the show at this point. Anyway, so yeah, Project Atomic has been an interesting exercise during the Fedora 21 release, because Fedora 21 was supposed to be all about kind of stepping back and as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, the QA stuff and basically retooling processes and everything and having time to do all of those things. And then we popped in with the idea of doing Atomic, somewhere in like June in Fedora?
Yeah, there was talk about it a little before that, but it wasn't serious till midsummer pretty much.
So we actually managed, a bit of a fire drill as far as dealing with the build systems and things like that goes. But managed to get through all of the hurdles and had some great cooperation between QA and release engineering and the cloud working group, and a little bit, I think, from the base work group and some other folks to pull out an Atomic version from the cloud flavor, so which is customized to run Docker containers and that sort of thing. What do you think about that? You were very active in the cloud work group for a long time before you became the Fedora project leader. How do you feel about that direction as part of the cloud work group and as part of where Fedora is going?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think that so the basic model that Atomic has is a fairly minimal but batteries included base operating system where it basically is tailored to do just one thing. You don't really customize it very much. In fact, we use a thing called RPM OS tree, which is sort of a remote Git repository for your operating system. So you can, instead of upgrading RPMs individually, you basically check out the remote tree at certain points. And as it is right now, you make local configuration changes, but you don't make local changes to the package set. So if you want to install some package, you don't. What you do instead is install containers, in this case Docker containers, running the different applications you want to run. So you basically have this minimal core with containerized applications that run on top of it. And this is something that is a kind of a general trend in the operating system world right now. So Ubuntu just had a release with their Ubuntu Core thing, and CoreOS has been doing it for a while. And so Atomic is kind of our exploration of that same space. And I think that right now we're working on that as sort of the basis for the cloud image, especially because with the Docker container story, it makes sense to do it that way. But I can see this as it becomes more successful being a way that we actually put together the whole distribution in some number of years from now as sort of the primary version of Fedora.
Cool. And I apologize if I re-ask any questions that were asked earlier in the show. We had some technical difficulties behind the scene, which is why it sort of seemed like a Zonker and Mathew show for a little while there. But I'm more curious about it sort of from the perspective of the relationship between Fedora and Red Hat. Is Red Hat solely a subset of what Fedora is doing, or are they bringing their own packages into it, or how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so Fedora is an independent project with its own community-based governance that is sponsored by Red Hat. So Red Hat pays my salary and the salary of a lot of other people to work on Fedora, both full-time and also other parts of their job. But Red Hat, it is distinct from what Red Hat is doing in the Red Enterprise Linux distribution, and the decisions that are made in Fedora often Red Hat takes part as a major stakeholder. So if they have a direction that they're interested in for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, they may explore that in Fedora, but they don't actually just go and do things in Fedora that necessarily end up in Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And on the other side, Red Hat Enterprise Linux Red Hat makes their own independent decisions for what software that is in Fedora ends up being in the enterprise product. But there is a pretty strong relationship there. So if you want to follow things that may be in Red Enterprise Linux later, or even better than follow, engage with and have some influence over, Fedora is a really great place to participate.
Cool. And so how about commercial support? I know that obviously Red Hat's whole business model is making, selling you RHEL licenses that you'll end up paying them lots and lots of money for lots and lots of servers. Is there also commercial support for Fedora, or does that question even make sense?
It might make sense. We certainly don't do it in the Fedora project, and I'm not aware of anybody else who is doing that. Our answer basically is if you want commercial support, that Red Hat Enterprise Linux is probably a better choice for you, because there's a whole, again, I'm an employee, so I'm biased, but there's a whole great organization that is really focused on doing a great job at doing that.
Is there enough money coming in from Red Hat that you don't have to worry about monetizing Fedora as well?
Yeah, this gets into strategy decisions that are far above my head, but I think Red Hat has no interest in monetizing Fedora. The monetization aspect of it is the services around Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I guess go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Or were you done? I couldn't tell.
I think it's a really interesting model that Red Hat has there as well, because they're not selling you the software; they're selling you a subscription, which includes support and a number of other services around it. Whereas, the distribution itself stays completely open source, which is what enables things like CentOS as well.
I wonder if CentOS has a commercial support. This is a weird question. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out this whole. I don't know of any other projects that have like this many multiple layers, though. Are you aware of others that are sort of like this?
Not exactly in the same way. I guess in some ways, it's a very different set of complication. But the Debian, Ubuntu, and all the different Debian rebuilds are kind of an ecosystem that is parallel in some ways.
Okay.
I guess
sorry for putting you on the spot.
Universe, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So what's the I believe the license has to be GPL version 2, or are there various licenses for Fedora?
Yeah, so we have our own set of acceptable licenses in Fedora, and it is a fairly broad list. We accept basically all of the GPLs, and basically free and libre open source software in general is accepted, and non-free software isn't. And we are pretty restrictive, even in almost all cases. Everything is all open source. We do allow firmware under redistributable licenses, but that's only when it's firmware that's not running on the host operating system.
And just as I
Every-
was, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, everything else is genuinely open source, and we don't, for example, ship NVIDIA proprietary drivers and things like that, even though they are possibly redistributable.
Cool, cool. So I heard a little bit of this just as my audio was starting to have really bad problems earlier in the show. So is this more of a desktop Linux, or is it more of a server Linux, or I heard you talk about cloud Linux. Are you focused on any one of the three, or is it really going across the board?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a repeat here, but if you look on the getfedora.org site, the little URL right down here in this corner here, there's we are actually previously the kind of approach had been Fedora is everything for everybody. The default is a desktop, but you do whatever you want with it, and it is still the case that the wider Fedora project has. You can do whatever you want with it as the main Fedora umbrella, but we have sort of these focused areas where we have a workstation, server, and cloud to fit these three different areas that we kind of felt the distribution is pulling in these three different ways. So we thought separating them and then trying to play to the strengths of each of those areas would be the best. And then each of these is like kind of specific. So you can see one of the things that the workstation, which is the desktop offering, is not just a general purpose Linux desktop, but we are trying to focus that on being really excellent for people who are software developers. Not just, here's the cat again. Hello, cat. Not just software developers who are working on software in Fedora, but who are like building things on top of Fedora or building it in the cloud or for whatever other purpose. We want it to be a really good desktop for them. That doesn't mean that it's just restricted to developers. Developers are human beings as well, and so an operating system that's good for developers should be a good desktop for just about anybody else. Everybody wants to play music, write documents, browse the web, do their email, those kind of things. But if you're using Fedora and that's not your cup of tea, we also have other alternate desktop environments, KDE, XFCE, those kind of things, which are an important part of the project as well. But we're kind of turning our marketing focus on getting to these specific segments.
So back to me again. Before we plow on, I did want to address a question raised a few minutes ago. Randall, I think, had asked, are there other projects that have a similar model to Fedora? And I would say that SUSE and OpenSUSE have a very similar relationship in terms of the way that they try to produce the community distribution and then monetize it later in SUSE Linux Enterprise Server and all that. One thing I wanted to ask, Fedora Project Leader is a unique job, and everybody who does the job sort of brings their own skills to it, and it's not the same. It's not necessarily the same job from person to person, but maybe talk a little bit about what do you actually do as the Fedora project leader? What is it, what's a typical day? What does that entail? What are you responsible for as the Fedora project leader?
Email and IRC meetings. I'm a writer, it actually turns out. That's my main job. There's a lot of communication involved in talking to people. I think that's kind of the primary job. It is a leadership role, but it is also one where it's not a dictator role or a top-down leadership at all, where it's something where I want to talk to the community and sort of find common goals and common directions and kind of get everybody energized and excited about going in the same direction. And so there's the common metaphor about herding cats. So this is sort of a step beyond herding cats, because it's kind of trying to find, not to tell the cats to go in this direction, but to try to find out where the cats really want to go and then encourage them to actually work together to get to that goal.
Was that why you had the cats on earlier? Was that like a visual aid for the...
Right, yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Cats do what they do, I guess that's...
One of my favorite hobbies, there's the saying about, you don't want to talk about certain things in politics. That's like touching the third rail. I'm not only a fan of touching the third rail. I will actually lick the third rail given the opportunity. Let's talk about System D a little bit, because I know that that's one of people's favorite topics to bring up because it has a whiff of controversy about it. How has that been? Because Fedora is sort of ground zero for adoption for System D and development.
Yeah. System D landed in Fedora 15. I was actually outside of Red Hat as a community contributor at the time, and I actually argued strongly against it landing in Fedora 14 because I felt like it was really early and kind of scary for Fedora at that point. And it's gone through, that's 3.5 years ago now, so it's gone through a lot of maturing, and I've always thought it's been an interesting project, and I think it's been really interesting to also see it mature in Fedora and become a really integral and great part of the distribution. I was actually on a podcast just a little bit ago where Leonard was also on a segment separate from me talking about System D and the origin of it. And so one of the things he talked about, and I'm going to talk about again, is that I've seen in the System D flame wars kind of a conspiracy theory about Red Hat, pushing the Red Hat agenda onto the rest of the world and trying to take control with System D. And it's actually the fact that Red Hat was a little taken aback by System D and not quite sure what to make of it when it came out as well. And so going through the process of testing out in Fedora wasn't quite so much forced on Fedora by Red Hat as some conspiracy theories kind of lead people to believe. But it was kind of a developer-inspired project, and they really wanted to help have Fedora demonstrate the value of it. And in doing that, it did end up in Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7. And I think that its time incubating in Fedora really did help it be sort of the thing that is becoming a standard part of the Linux ecosystem everywhere.
So it's not inconceivable when it was first introduced that System D could have been yanked back out in favor of something else if it hadn't worked out.
Yeah, and in the theoretical world, that things could always change again. Although I think that it is proving to be enough of a success that that's unlikely to happen unless there are some really big radical upsets. And a System D really one of the things System D. In addition to just sort of replacing the aging init system, which wasn't, there was nothing wrong with it for what it did. It just didn't do. There are some things that it could have done better, but didn't. But oh well. But getting your system booted up, it did a fine job. But sort of the way that the Linux kernel works, the way hardware works these days, it wasn't quite scaling well. Where everything, where your hardware is dynamic and can be added and removed while your system is running. The init process wasn't, the traditional init wasn't really meant to cope with that. And there are a lot of great new features in the Linux kernel, like dgroups, that Systemd takes advantage of. I worked in one of my previous jobs with high performance computing and with also with batch scheduling, and we always had processes that would escape their control of the scheduling system and be running after they were supposed to be killed. And so Systemd has some neat things in it where you can make sure that all the processes that are attached to a process tree are in a group and can be scheduled together and given resource constraints. And it's a lot of really cool stuff that can enable us to do things that we couldn't do as easily with the init system we had before. And this is really going to play into the container story as well, because Systemd has a lot of great container support built into it.
So what are you looking at now? We're already, the nice thing about Fedora development is you get like a full 20, 30 minutes off between finishing the last release and starting work or completing work for the next one. What are you looking forward to for Fedora 22? Like, what are the features that, you can predict now are likely to land or you really want to see land in Fedora 22?
Yeah, so this is going to be what's going to feel like a really short release cycle. After having a year to work on this one, we're back to the 6-month cycle, and also just because of the timing with the holidays here and some conferences and things in January, it's going to feel like a very short cycle. We were already in the planning phase for Fedora 22, and the deadline for new feature change proposals is mid-January. So I think that not everything is on the table already, but I think that from a user point of view, it's largely going to look like a refinement of what we have in Fedora 21, a little bit of improvements and polish, or maybe try and do some user testing based on our target audiences and make some adjustments based on those things. But there's a lot of kind of infrastructure changes that are under the hood. So we're switching from Python 2 to Python 3 as the default Python. We have a new package manager that is called DNF that is slated to replace Yum as our main command line package manager interface. It's a little bit unclear if that's going to actually be renamed to Yum at that point or stay named DNF. We'll see how that goes. That's actually based on a depth solver from SUSE, so that kind of brings us into a bigger open source universe that way. What else? Atomic. I think that right now Fedora Atomic is sort of in its early generations in the cloud image. That's going to go a step further. We're going to include a version of Atomic that will install to hardware if you want to build a sort of a scale out infrastructure, still kind of cloud focused, but your cloud could be running on native hardware rather than running in a virtual machine somewhere.
The definition between, we found it's sort of interesting to figure out when does something belong with the cloud work group, when does something belong with the base work group, and when does something belong with the server folks. Seems to be pretty relatively easy to make the definition. Well, this is GNOME, so it goes to the workstation folks, but it gets a little fuzzier when you're talking about things in the server room. One of the questions I saw pop up after the release, we targeted very heavily making it understood that the workstation release targets developers. But do you want to talk a minute about the fact that we're still aiming for average? I don't mean to use average as a negative, but average users as well as developers on the desktop.
Yeah, I mentioned that a couple of minutes ago, but I think the upstream project GNOME that we're using to build Fedora Workstation is very much focused on building a general purpose Linux distribution, and we think that's a good starting point for what we're doing, because developers in general want the same things that normal people want from their system. They want their laptop to just work, and so but having that target audience helps us sort of get what feedback to prioritize, where are the areas we should really work on in order to kind of grow in that segment, with sort of just a general marketing rule that, or not, it's not even a marketing rule, it's a world rule. If you try to make everybody happy, you're going to end up with everybody kind of meh. So we want to try and make one segment of people really happy, and from that, we hope that general adoption will be able to flow.
Any thoughts on Wayland making it into Fedora 22? I know we have the experimental stuff, but when do you think that might be ready for prime time?
Right. So Wayland is sort of the next generation graphical interface, replacing X.org as basically the thing that gets your desktop to you onto your screen. And we have that as a preview version in Fedora 21, and it is my understanding that it is also going to be a preview in Fedora 22 with a hope for landing it as the default in Fedora 23 a year from now. And I actually haven't tried it myself, at least not recently. It didn't work for me when I tried it 6 months ago. But I've heard reports from people that it works pretty seamlessly, at least for certain subsets of things that you're doing. And this is neat because in addition to sort of being the next generation technology, the security model for Wayland is much better. And so if we want to go to a model where we're running containerized applications on the desktop as well as just for, Docker cloud kind of style things, Wayland is kind of a prerequisite.
Another question I saw come up in chat, I'll go ahead and throw out there, though. With the different flavors, are there any packages that you can't install on one or the other? Is there any difference between the packages that you get, say, major differences between the kernel or anything else when you're going from workstation to cloud to server?
Right. So all the packages are drawn from the same package set and the same repository. We may end up sort of breaking up the repositories a little bit in the future to solve some other problems, but it's drawn from all the same package set. And the reason we have a base working group is because we want to have a common base to it. But some of the configuration is different, and that's actually done by bringing in different packages that have different configuration files in the packages. But it is still the same package set, and you can basically install everything everywhere, although in some cases it doesn't necessarily make sense to start from server and try to go to workstation there. You might kind of get sort of a conflict of configuration and confusion. You can also do a basic network install and start from minimal and build up whatever you want from there. And you could build up something that looks like a workstation or a server system from there that isn't necessarily in what our sort of target product release looks like.
Hey, so I'm actually curious. I'm not really much of a Linux guy. Yeah, I think it answered it pretty well. I'm not much of a Linux guy, so excuse this my Linux ignorance. But I see Fedora and Debian, and there's a couple of other major flavors. I guess what we're talking about there is the what gets added above and beyond kernel space, the user utilities, the way the system boots, and all that sort of stuff. Is there any effort to unify that across these various flavors, or is it going to just continue to diverge with each one having their own special features?
Well, I think we all kind of have different ideas about how things will look, so we have different distributions in the first place. There's been historically some things like the Linux standard base, which have attempted to bring a unified target to the world, and those have not been very successful. But going back to systemd from the earlier discussion about that, there's definitely a vision from the systemd developers of having bringing more unity to the world through having a shared init system and a shared set of services that init system provides, and that's part of why that in fact that is some of the tension around systemd comes from that, because traditionally the decisions for what those things should look like kind of happen at the distribution level. And if things are happening at the systemd project level instead of the distribution level, it kind of changes how the conversation works, and people aren't always ready for that change or able to engage in it in a very not sure how to engage in it in a useful way. So I think that there is some work around that in the systemd space, and I think that hopefully as we, if we kind of do go into this containerized world, I think that will also bring some unity to the way everything works, because I mean, it's sort of one of the reasons Docker is such an appealing story is because what they tell you is you build a Docker container wherever, and then you can run it on top of any operating system as long as it has the Linux kernel. It will run basically the same way everywhere. Now that's not actually, it's more of a story than the actual truth, because the kernel is actually a fairly important component for a lot of things, and so there's actually will be some differences in how things work. But that's the story, and that's the appeal of it. And so I know the systemd developers have an idea for a containerized desktop application thing where different distributions would basically provide known APIs, and then you could actually apply that API on top of any other distribution. So if something targeted Fedora and you wanted to run it on Ubuntu, you could pull down the Fedora runtime and run it on Ubuntu, or vice versa. And that's kind of in a theory stage, but it's an interesting direction that possibly things will be going.
It's sounds like a lot of the differences between the Linux distributions are a lot like the reasons that the BSDs have also diverged. You know, you have FreeBSD, NetBSD, OpenBSD. It all started with a common trunk, and still share a lot of functionality back and forth. But I know there's no real effort to unify them. And it sounds like that's because part of it is, you know, it's an advantage that FreeBSD already has ZFS in the kernel, and OpenBSD is now sort of adding that, I understand, and makes a big difference with that. So I can definitely see. We're almost out of time, though. So I want to ask the big question, which is, what haven't we covered that you want to make sure our audience is aware of?
One of the things I think is interesting in Fedora from a level different from the engineering and from the distribution itself is that we are moving to a new governance model for the project, where we previously, in addition to the Fedora project leader, the top governance for the project was the Fedora board. And that's gone through several incarnations or different over the years of different sort of focuses on things. But it had kind of gotten to a state where people weren't quite sure what the board was doing, and the people who were elected to the board were good people who were active in the project, but often not necessarily the people who were doing the day-to-day hands-on kind of things, and had kind of a hands-off approach to things where they ended up being kind of a Supreme Court view of how to be at the top level of the project. So if somebody had something that felt like it wasn't getting resolved anywhere else, they would bring it to the board for a decision, and the board would talk about it and offer some sort of opinion. And with a lot of what's going on in the operating system world, where we kind of feel like we need a lot of changes, and it was kind of hard to do things that made an impact in the distribution without having a top level body that was kind of more empowered to be more active. So our new governance body is the Fedora Council, and we're actually not just a governance body, but a governance and leadership body. So we're kind of more setting goals. And again, like I said earlier, it's not a top-down goal setting. It's kind of a finding what the goals are and sort of identifying them and rallying the whole project around them. So we have the new model that is based around that, and based on a consensus decision-making model with a default to yes kind of attitude. So we want to empower people to do things, and rather than waiting for the board to rubber stamp it, or worrying that at some point the board's going to have someone's going to come to the board and something you've been working on will get a denial. Have a sort of a more active, engaged body with the people who are working on things, kind of working on project strategy at that level, and making active decisions for the project leadership.
Very cool. And I want to make sure we're clear here. You are saying board and not Borg, right?
Borg, yeah. No, board. But now it's council, which is more a low bandwidth friendly word, I guess.
Yeah, with my limited challenge bandwidth, things are coming out a little bit weird here. I have to ask my two required questions, and you probably have heard the show before. So what's your favorite scripting language?
Oh boy, that's a trick one. I read the Llama book when I was in high school. It was awesome. But I'm gonna have to say that it's Python at this point. I still have a soft spot in my heart for Perl, though, for sure.
Okay, and your favorite text editor?
Joe's own editor. I love it. I had used WordStar to write papers long ago, and those Borland text editors from again long ago. Those key bindings are just come naturally to me. But failing that, it's nice to have VI as a fallback. It's always there.
I almost feel betrayed. I always thought you were a fellow Vimmer.
Yeah, it's okay. Vim's a fallback.
Very cool, very cool. Well, thank you for answering those questions, and I do appreciate the Perl shout out, even though you have slipped into the dark side. That's okay with me. So Mathew Miller, thank you for coming on the show and talking about Fedora 21.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Very good. That was Mathew Miller, representing the Fedora Project in general, but talking specifically about some of the cool things in Fedora 21 and the upcoming roadmap for Fedora 22. Zonker, what do you think about that?
I'm really excited about the Fedora 22 roadmap. Enjoy talking to Mathew pretty much on a daily basis, so it was fun to actually have him on and talk, in real time as opposed to over IRC. Although apparently the bandwidth requirements for IRC are much lower, so that's helpful.
Yeah, I'm definitely having that problem. I'm having that problem here because definitely my audio and video are not going to be very good for this particular show. I'm going to have to find some other solution when I'm actually at home. Maybe I'll go find a restaurant or something to actually broadcast from. Anyway, so I don't have much more to say about that either. Again, like I said, I'm not a Linux guy, but I'm glad that Fedora continues to plow forward. I like the change in the governance model there. I think that's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. So to continue on, my awkward transition of the day for going to my upcoming guest list is going to be that there aren't any upcoming guests. This is unusual in that I usually try to book a quarter ahead of time almost, and I have been so jammed up with lots of conferences and the holidays and cruises and things that I just haven't been getting my act together entirely about getting things up, which is why I really appreciate you, Zonker, for coming on and making this guest happen this week, so thank you for that. There is an actual event, though, that'll happen on the live stream during our normal taping slot on New Year's Eve. Apparently, the entire TWIT team is getting together, and we're going to have a big New Year's Eve celebration from 3 a.m. to 3 a.m. Leo time, I like to call it. That's Pacific time, West Coast. And I am going to be part of that. I'm actually starting the day with breakfast with Leo at about 6 in the morning. And then we're going to have something on around 8:30, the normal taping time for this show, with Leo and me and Aaron Newcomb. Going to be talking about the contribution of open source to the makerspace for a half hour. And then I'm going to be on various other pop-in, it'll be like Spot Randall during the day kind of thing. So that'll be kind of fun. But I'm planning on being there hopefully all the way to midnight so I can celebrate with the crew. And it should be a lot of fun. So look on that on New Year's Eve. There's no show next week. Apparently the Christmas Eve is probably a bad day to have people work at the Twit Cottage or Twit Brick House. So there's no show next week as well. And I will start filling in Q1. I promise you. I already have 3 or 4 people that are saying, when are your Q1 dates going to come up? Because we need them now. So I will make sure that happens. All right. Let's see. So yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the Schwartzian transform. I did not name it that. I'm not that vain. But it was named after me because I posted this thing. For those of you that don't know what it is, there's if you look for Schwartzian transform in Wikipedia, it was there. I made a nice posting yesterday on Google+, and I just had to have a musical intro to it. Anytime something hits a 20th anniversary, I think of some way to use Sgt. Pepper at the opening sequence. So here it is you're going to hear me sing, it's scary. It was 20 years ago today. The Schwartzian transform began to play. It traded a bit of space for time, and it was copied from Lisp, and that's fine. Soon other languages adopted it as well, making Randall Schwartz feel pretty swell. Schwartzian transform used across the land. So that's my 20th anniversary posting for the Schwartzian transform. God, I hope that came across on the stream. Anyway, nothing much else to say. I'll be in Cuba in mid-January. If you're in Cuba and watching this show, please come find me and send me back to the States. And I'll also be at Scale in February. That's the only things I have upcoming. How about you, Zonker? Where are you going to be?
Lord, everywhere. So I go to New Zealand on the 8th. So I'll be at LinuxConf AU, and then I will be at FOSDEM, Config Management Camp, Infrastructure.next in Ghent after FOSDEM. And then the following weekend, I'll be in the Czech Republic for DevCont CZ. And then I get about a week and a half off, and then I'll be at Scale right there with you. So pretty much just if you're at a conference in the next 2.5 months, look around. The odds are I'm there someplace.
Great, cool. I look forward to seeing you at Scale, and of course seeing you online here and helping me co-host future shows as your schedule starts loosening up a little bit. And again, thank you very much for bringing on today's guest. I really appreciate that.
You having us on. It's a lot of fun.
Very cool. Great. Well, again, apologize for the junky bandwidth. We tried 2 different ways to get this show out today, but hopefully you can hear me between all the little glitches and things like that. So we'll see you at the New Year's Eve party if you tune in for the live stream. I hope some of that is taped so I can watch some of it. And we'll see you again next time on FLOSS Weekly.